Once upon a time, in a small city nestled between rolling hills, there was a prestigious medical college known for producing some of the finest doctors in the country. However, beneath the college's reputation for academic excellence, there were whispers of inequality and discrimination that ran through its corridors. Among its teachers was a woman named Mrs. Thompson, a well-respected professor of internal medicine, but notorious for her hidden biases. She came from an affluent background and often looked down upon students who came from underprivileged families. One of her students, a bright and determined young woman named Amina, came to understand this reality all too well. Amina had grown up in a poor neighborhood, raised by her single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for her daughter. From a young age, Amina had dreamed of becoming a doctor, a healer, someone who could make a real difference in the world. Her mother often reminded her, "Education is your key, Amina. It will unlock doors for you that nothing else can." With her mother's encouragement, Amina studied hard and, despite facing many challenges, secured a scholarship to the prestigious medical college. When Amina entered the college, she knew she didn't quite fit in. Her clothes were simple, and while her peers discussed expensive vacations and the latest gadgets, Amina focused on her studies. Her intelligence was undeniable, and her passion for medicine was unmatched. But no matter how much she excelled in her classes, there was always one person who seemed determined to see her fail: Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson noticed Amina from the first day she walked into her lecture hall. It wasn't just her skin color or her modest background that irritated the professor. It was the fact that despite all the odds stacked against her, Amina was excelling. In her eyes, someone like Amina didn't belong in the ranks of future doctors. Mrs. Thompson had always held the belief that only certain people deserved to practice medicine, and Amina, being a poor black girl, wasn't one of them. The tension between them grew over time. Mrs. Thompson would often humiliate Amina in front of the class, questioning her answers, doubting her abilities, and making snide remarks about her background. "How can someone from your circumstances even think they can keep up here?" she once said during a particularly harsh confrontation. One fateful day, things reached a breaking point. Amina had worked tirelessly on a project that she hoped would impress her professor. But instead of praise, she received nothing but harsh criticism. "This is completely unacceptable," Mrs. Thompson sneered, her voice cold and cutting. "You don't belong here, Amina. You're never going to make it in this field. Leave now, before you embarrass yourself any further." The words hit Amina like a slap across the face. Her hands trembled as she gathered her belongings, tears welling in her eyes. The humiliation was unbearable, and it felt as though her dreams were shattering in front of her. As she walked out of the classroom, the whispers of her classmates followed her, and she fought back the urge to break down completely. She had never felt so small. Amina could have given up that day. She could have let the words of a prejudiced teacher define her future. But deep inside her, there was a fire that would not be extinguished. She went home that night and cried into her pillow. But when the sun rose the next morning, she wiped her tears away and resolved to prove Mrs. Thompson wrong. She transferred to another medical school where the environment was more supportive, and she flourished. Despite the pain she had endured, Amina never lost sight of her goal. She graduated at the top of her class and went on to specialize in rare and complex diseases. Years passed, and Amina became known as one of the leading experts in her field. Her name appeared in medical journals, and patients from all over sought her out for her expertise. She had finally achieved everything she had dreamed of, though the memory of her time at the old college still lingered like a scar she carried with her. One day, Amina received an emergency call from a nearby hospital. A patient had been admitted with an unknown disease, and the doctors were at a loss. When she arrived at the hospital, she was directed to the ICU. As she entered the room, she froze in her tracks. Lying on the bed, frail and pale, was Mrs. Thompson. The once proud and harsh professor was now a shadow of her former self, her body weakened by the mysterious illness. A nurse approached Amina and whispered, "No one else knows how to treat her. We've tried everything. You're her last hope." Mrs. Thompson hadn't yet seen Amina, and as the doctor stepped forward, the older woman slowly opened her eyes. When their gazes met, Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened in shock. She recognized the face before her, older now, more confident, but unmistakably the same girl she had once driven out of her class. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. The realization of the situation hung heavily in the air. The woman who had humiliated Amina, who had told her she would never succeed, was now entirely dependent on her for survival. Mrs. Thompson, now unable to speak properly due to her illness, tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Tears filled her eyes, a mix of fear and perhaps even regret. Amina, standing over her former teacher, felt a surge of emotions. She remembered the pain, the tears, and the humiliation. She had every reason to walk out of that room, to let Mrs. Thompson suffer the consequences of her own cruelty. But Amina had long since risen above that. She had become the doctor she had always wanted to be, and now, standing at the bedside of the woman who once tried to destroy her, she understood the true power of compassion and forgiveness. Without a word, Amina began her work. She consulted with the nurses and reviewed the charts. Hours passed as she meticulously pieced together a treatment plan, using all her expertise to save the life of the very person who had once tried to ruin hers. Days later, after countless treatments and long nights, Mrs. Thompson slowly began to recover. As she regained her strength, she asked to speak with Amina. When the doctor entered the room, Mrs. Thompson looked at her with tears in her eyes. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice weak but sincere. Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled with regret. "I never thought that you'd become someone so capable, so brilliant. I wronged you. I let my prejudice and pride cloud my judgment, and I hurt you. I'm sorry, Amina." Amina stood quietly, taking in the apology. She could see that Mrs. Thompson's words, though late, were genuine. The professor, once a towering figure of authority, now appeared frail and vulnerable, not just because of her illness, but because she had come face to face with her own failings. For a moment, Amina thought back to the girl she had been, the one who had walked out of that classroom with tears in her eyes, humiliated and broken. She thought of how far she had come since that day. All the struggles, the sleepless nights, the doubts, none of it had defeated her. Instead, it had shaped her into the woman she had become, a woman who could heal not just bodies, but also wounds of the heart. "I don't need your apology," Amina finally said, her voice calm but firm. "What you did to me was wrong, but it doesn't define who I am. I became the doctor I am today because of my determination, my hard work, and the support of those who believed in me." Mrs. Thompson lowered her gaze, ashamed. "I wish I had seen it then. You had so much potential. More than I could ever acknowledge." Amina took a step closer, her face softening. "You couldn't see it because you chose not to. But it doesn't matter now. I didn't come here today because of what happened between us. I came because you were a patient who needed help. And that's what I do. I heal." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears once more. "You're a better person than I ever was." Amina gave a small, sad smile. "It's not about being better. It's about doing what's right. That's the kind of doctor I wanted to be." For the next few days, Amina continued to monitor Mrs. Thompson's recovery. The older woman's health gradually improved, and the tension that had once existed between them began to ease. Mrs. Thompson, now fully aware of the irony of the situation, spent much of her time in quiet reflection, haunted by the mistakes of her past. She had once been so sure of who deserved to succeed, of who was worthy of respect. But now, lying in that hospital bed, saved by the very person she had belittled, she realized how narrow her view of the world had been. Before Mrs. Thompson was discharged, she asked to see Amina one last time. When the doctor entered the room, Mrs. Thompson held out a trembling hand, and Amina took it. "I will never forget what you've done for me," Mrs. Thompson said. "You showed me kindness when I deserved none. You saved my life, and taught me something far more valuable than any lesson I've ever taught in a classroom." Amina nodded, her expression gentle. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Thompson. And remember, every life is worth saving, no matter where it comes from." As Amina left the hospital that day, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The scars of her past would always be there, but they no longer held power over her. She had risen above the hate, the prejudice, and the pain. In the end, she hadn't just saved Mrs. Thompson's life. She had shown her the true meaning of humanity. And for Amina, that was the greatest victory of all. The story didn't end there, of course. Amina continued her career, treating patients from all walks of life, always with the same compassion and dedication. But she never forgot that moment in the hospital. The moment. She realized just how powerful kindness and forgiveness could be. In her journey, she learned that sometimes healing wasn't just about curing disease. Sometimes it was about healing the divisions between people, about showing grace when none was expected. And that, above all, was what made her the extraordinary doctor she had always dreamed of becoming. Years passed, and Amina's reputation only grew. She became a well-known specialist, sought after by hospitals and clinics around the world, for her expertise in treating rare and complex diseases. But despite her success, she remained humble and dedicated to the values that had carried her through her darkest moments. She remembered what it felt like to be doubted, to be treated as less than worthy, and she made it her mission to ensure that no one else in her care ever felt that way. Mrs. Thompson, now retired, lived quietly. Her recovery from the mysterious illness had given her not just a second chance at life, but a new perspective. She spent much of her time reading and reflecting on the things she had once taken for granted, the privileges, the biases she never questioned, and the lives of her students, especially Amina. She reached out to Amina several times, sending letters of gratitude, though Amina rarely responded beyond a polite acknowledgement. Mrs. Thompson didn't blame her. She knew that forgiveness was a gift, not something owed. One day, years after their hospital encounter, Mrs. Thompson was invited to speak at a medical school event. She hesitated, unsure if she had anything of value to offer anymore, but something in her heart urged her to accept. When she arrived at the event, she found herself standing before a group of young, eager students, just as Amina had once been. As she looked out over the audience, Mrs. Thompson began her speech. "There was a time when I believed I understood what it meant to be a good doctor," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I thought it was about intelligence, skill, and perhaps a little luck. But I was wrong. Being a good doctor is about so much more than that. It's about compassion, about seeing the humanity in every person who comes to you for help, regardless of who they are or where they come from." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the students. "I once had a student who taught me that lesson in a way I'll never forget. She was bright, determined, and everything I failed to see in her at the time. But she became the doctor I never could, not just because of her skill, but because of her heart. And in the end, she saved my life." Mrs. Thompson's words hung in the air, and the room was silent. I learned from her that humility is one of the greatest gifts a doctor can have. To heal, you must be willing to see beyond yourself, beyond your biases, and reach out to those in need, no matter who they are. As Mrs. Thompson finished her speech, the students applauded, but her mind was elsewhere, back with Amina, the girl she had once doubted, who had shown her the true meaning of what it is to be a healer. Amina, unaware of Mrs. Thompson's speech, continued her work tirelessly. She had long since moved past the pain of her college years, channeling her energy into caring for her patients and mentoring young doctors who reminded her of herself. Occasionally, she would think of Mrs. Thompson, not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet understanding. People changed. Life had a way of teaching even the hardest hearts. One evening, as Amina sat at her desk, a letter arrived. It was from a former student of Mrs. Thompson who had attended the medical event. In it, the student recounted Mrs. Thompson's speech, how she had spoken about the lesson she learned from Amina, the student who had once been wronged but had gone on to save her. Amina read the letter slowly, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. She hadn't expected Mrs. Thompson to speak of her publicly, nor had she thought that their story would touch so many. She put the letter down and looked out of her window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. In that moment, Amina realized that her journey had come full circle. The pain, the prejudice, the struggle. It had all led her to this point. She had become not just a doctor, but a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of humanity. And perhaps in some small way, she had helped change Mrs. Thompson too. For Amina, the story was not about revenge or redemption. It was about growth, about rising above the limitations others had tried to place on her, and about the incredible strength it took to heal not just bodies, but hearts. She had become the doctor she always dreamed of being, but more importantly, she had become the person she was meant to be. And with that, Amina knew that the past no longer held her. She was free. After reading the letter, Amina sat quietly, absorbing the weight of the moment. Though she had long since forgiven Mrs. Thompson in her heart, hearing that the professor had publicly acknowledged her mistakes was something Amina hadn't expected. It was a kind of closure she hadn't known she needed. Life moved forward, as it always did. Amina continued her work, leading groundbreaking research in her field, mentoring young doctors, and traveling to underserved communities to provide medical care. Her heart was full, her mission clear. She had found her place in the world, and nothing could shake her resolve to help others. One day, Amina was invited to speak at a conference on medical ethics. She had given many talks before, but this one felt different. As she stood in front of a room full of medical professionals, she began to tell her story, not just about the science of medicine, but about the humanity behind it. She spoke about the struggles she had faced, the discrimination she had endured, and the moment she had been kicked out of Mrs. Thompson's class all those years ago. "But I didn't let that moment define me," Amina said, her voice calm but resolute. "I chose to rise above it. I chose to pursue my dreams, not out of spite or a need for revenge, but because I believed in the power of healing, both physical and emotional. And that belief has guided me every step of the way." The audience was captivated. Amina's story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was about the transformative power of kindness, forgiveness, and resilience. As she finished her speech, the room erupted in applause, but Amina wasn't looking for validation. She knew that her journey, her success, had come from within. As she stepped off the stage, a young woman approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "Dr. Amina," she began hesitantly, "I've read about your work and how you've helped so many people. Your story today, it moved me. I've been struggling in medical school, feeling like I don't belong because of where I come from. But hearing your story, it gave me hope. It reminded me why I wanted to become a doctor in the first place. Amina smiled warmly and placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong," she said softly. "Your journey may be difficult, but that's what will make you stronger. Hold on to your purpose. That's what will carry you through." The young woman nodded, visibly emotional, and Amina saw a reflection of her younger self in her eyes. She knew that, just as she had been given a second chance, she could offer that same encouragement to others. Time passed, and Mrs. Thompson, now retired and living a quieter life, often thought about Amina. She reflected on the years when she had held such narrow views and how one student had opened her eyes to the truth. She had reached out to Amina several times but never expected anything in return. Mrs. Thompson was content knowing that Amina had forgiven her in her own way, and that was enough. Years later, when Mrs. Thompson passed away, she left behind a legacy of learning and change. In her will, she donated a significant portion of her wealth to create scholarships for underprivileged students, students like Amina, who deserved a fair chance to pursue their dreams in medicine, without facing the barriers of discrimination or bias. The scholarship was named the Amina Fund, in honor of the student who had taught her the greatest lesson of all, that kindness and empathy have the power to heal wounds far deeper than those of the body. When Amina learned of the scholarship, she was deeply moved. She hadn't expected this final act of kindness from Mrs. Thompson, but it symbolized something profound. People could change, minds could open, healing could come in the most unexpected ways. In the end, Amina's life wasn't defined by the hardships she had faced or the wrongs done to her. It was defined by the choices she had made: to rise above, to forgive, to heal, and to give back. She had learned that healing was not just about treating the sick, but about mending the fractures between people, about creating a world where compassion and understanding could flourish. And as the years went on, Amina's legacy, like Mrs. Thompson's, became one of love, resilience, and the belief that everyone, no matter where they came from, had the power to change the world. As the years went on, Amina continued to live a life of purpose, filled with the same drive and compassion that had guided her through her most challenging times. She became more than just a renowned doctor. She was a symbol of perseverance, empathy, and grace. People from all walks of life looked up to her, not just for her medical achievements, but for the strength of her character. The Amina Fund scholarships created in Mrs. Thompson's name transformed the lives of countless students who, like Amina, had once struggled against the odds. These young men and women, coming from impoverished backgrounds, found doors opened to them that had once been shut. They became doctors, nurses, and healthcare professionals, driven not only by knowledge but by the deep empathy that comes from knowing hardship. Amina often mentored these students, sharing her wisdom and encouraging them to carry forward the lessons she had learned. One evening, at a medical conference, Amina was approached by a young scholarship recipient, beaming with excitement. "Doctor?" "Amina," she said, "I'm here because of you. The Amina Fund allowed me to study medicine, and now I'm about to graduate. I want to make a difference in the world, just like you have." Amina smiled, humbled by the words. "It's not about following my path," she said gently. "It's about creating your own. Medicine isn't just about curing illness. It's about healing in every sense. You have the power to bring hope and dignity to those who feel forgotten, to listen when no one else does, and to treat every person with the respect they deserve." The young woman nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "I will remember that," she promised. As Amina walked away from the conversation, she reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this point. She had come full circle, but in doing so, she realized that the most important lesson she had learned wasn't about overcoming obstacles or achieving success. It was about the transformative power of kindness and forgiveness. The world, Amina knew, could be harsh and unforgiving. It could judge people based on the color of their skin, their economic status, or their background. But true strength lay in the ability to rise above those judgments. It lay in the decision to extend kindness when none was offered in return, to forgive when it seemed impossible, and to heal not just the body, but the soul. Amina had healed Mrs. Thompson's body, but in doing so, she had also healed a deeper wound, the wound of prejudice, fear, and misunderstanding. Mrs. Thompson's legacy, though tainted by her past mistakes, had been redeemed by her final act of generosity. And Amina had learned that every person, no matter how flawed, had the capacity for growth and change. The lesson Amina carried with her was simple but profound. True healing goes beyond medicine. It is found in love, in forgiveness, and in the courage to lift others up, even when life has tried to tear them down. Amina's life was a testament to that truth. She had been broken, but she had rebuilt herself stronger. And in doing so, she had helped others find their own strength. As the years went by, her name became synonymous with not just medical excellence, but with hope. And long after she was gone, the lessons she taught would live on in the hearts of those she had touched. For Amina, that was the greatest legacy of all.